Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I am so excited to be here with all of you to celebrate the brand new book from our friends at Feminist Press. It came from the closet, Queer Reflections on Horror. It is edited and collected by my friend Joe Vallese. He is the editor of the other anthology, What's Your Exit? A Literary Detour Through New Jersey. His creative and pop culture writing appears in Bomb, Vice, Backstage, Pop Matters, Southeast Review, North American Review, Narrative Northeast, Via, among others. He has been a Pushcart Prize nominee and a notable in Best American Essays for his essay, Blood Brothers. He is currently a clinical associate professor in the expository writing program at New York University and previously served as site director and faculty for the Bard Prison Initiative. Joe holds an MFA in New York from New York University and MAT and BA degrees from Bard College. And I just have to shout out that Joey is my friend from Bard College, and I'm so proud of him and so excited. It is always very special when I get to celebrate a longtime friend's success. So I could not be more excited. Couldn't be more excited this is happening with one of our favorite presses, Feminist Press. So shout out to Feminist and congratulations to Joey. Our other contributors tonight, Sumiko Saulson is an award-winning author of Afro-Surrealist and Multicultural Sci-Fi and Horror, author of the Elgin-nominated collection Within Me, Without Me, and the novel Happiness and Other Diseases. Winner of the HWA Scholarship from Hell, BCC Voice Reframing the Other Contest, Mixie Award, Afro-Surrealist Writer Award, HWA Diversity Grant, Ladies of Horror Fiction Grant. Sumiko has an AA in English from Berkeley City College, writes a column called Writing While Black for a national Black newspaper, the San Francisco Bayview, and is the host of the Soma, Leather, and LGBT Cultural District's Erotic Storytelling Hour. They also teach speculative fiction at the Speculative Fiction Academy. Richard Scott Larson earned his MFA from the New York University, and he is the recent recipient of fellowships from MacDowell and the New York Foundation of the Arts. His creative and critical work has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Chicago Review of Books, Harvard Review, Colorado Review, Electric Literature, and elsewhere. His writing has also been listed as notable in the Best American Essays, and he is an active member of the National Book Critics Circle. Addie Tsai is a queer, non-binary artist and writer of color. They collaborated with Dominic Walsh Dance Theater on Victor Frankenstein and Camille Claudel, among others. Addie has an MFA in creative writing from Warren Wilson College and a PhD in dance from the Texas Women's University. She's the author of the queer Asian young adult novel Dear Twin, which will be relevant to our conversation tonight, and Unwieldy Creatures, their adult queer biracial retelling of Frankenstein. Came out earlier this year and we got to celebrate it. So go back in our YouTube and watch that event. It's really fun. They are fiction co-editor and editor of features and reviews at Anomaly, staff writer at Spectrum South, and founding editor and editor-in-chief at Just Femme and Dandy. And finally, Jude Ellison S. Doyle is a journalist, opinion writer, and the author of 2 nonfiction books, including Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers, Monstrosity, Patriarchy, and the Fear of Female Power, and Trainwreck, The Women We Love to Hate, Mock, and Fear, and Why. Ma, his horror comic with artist A.L. Kaplan, is out now in a collected edition from Boom Studios. So I hope everybody watching with us has some popcorn, is ready to dive in with some great folks. You now know who's in the room. I'm going to get out of the way and turn it over to Joy because I really want to get right into it. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being with Charis. Thanks to our friends watching at home. Feel free to ask questions at any time, and we will get those worked in towards the end of the conversation. But welcome to you all. Thanks for being here.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, ER, for those wonderful introductions. Thank you to everybody at Charis, and thank you to everybody who is tuning in with us right now. And thank you especially to Jude, Sumiko, Addie, and Richard. I want to start off by asking everybody a really important question that we need to get out of the way. I really want to know when you came out of the closet as a horror fan. So we'll start with Jude, if that's all right. Tell me something about your relationship to horror, either your affection for or lack of affection, or somewhere in between, and how that has influenced you either as an artist or, as a queer person, or both, or, something other. Let's think about ourselves in the space of horror and what horror is giving back to us.
Yeah, I was a little church kid. I wasn't allowed to watch many scary movies, and as all church kids inevitably do, by the time I was 12, I was like hanging out with the teen Satanists, and I was just like in these scuzzy basements, and they would always have like a movie on, and these guys were like, they were bigger than me, and they sold pot, and they were scary and they were mean. But I remember watching The Shining, and the moment when the lady in the bathtub turns into a wicked crow. This dude who's twice my size just like jumps up next to me onto the couch, like trying to shield himself. And it was like, I can watch this and you can't. And now I'm feeling like a sense of power from it. So I definitely it was a puberty thing for me where I would just like rent everything and I would get as many friends over as I could and just watch, then there were 4 alien movies in one night, but that just sort of never left me. It's like, this is the thing I need to do when I'm in a bad mood. This is how I will process my bad mood.
That's great. I can connect to that because I have 2 older brothers and older sister who were we were introduced to horror by our dad, who loved horror so much that we would have to change video stores really frequently because he would go through the whole horror section and then would sometimes come home with something he'd already watched, and we'd have to say, Dad, we saw this already. And I remember feeling, especially as a closeted kid, that, this was something that felt kind of macho, right? Like kind of like I didn't like sports, but horror I could hang with. And I really felt that. And I also would bring home friends, male buddies who I would scare with horror movies. And there was something really like both, conforming about that kind of manliness, but also super subversive because I felt like I knew something that they didn't. So yeah, I feel like we're connecting on that level. Richard, curious to hear from you.
So I guess I came to horror as a kid, as a reader. Like I had all these old paperbacks of Dean Koontz, Stephen King, obviously. So I was reading these books and identifying with them and super excited by them. And then I guess speaking of the video store, I walked through one day and I saw all these adaptations of these books I've been reading. And I'm like, oh my God, horror exists on screen too. I'd never been able to watch that kind of thing, So as a kid, I'm like, Mom, these movies are related to the books I'm reading. Can I watch them? She's like, okay. So I watched all of these movies, like The Shining and Christine, Salem's Lot, all these adaptations of books that I had read. And I was amazed that film could do the same thing that the books were doing for me. I could find myself in them as well. We didn't watch a lot of film growing up, so I didn't really understand it as a medium until I started seeing these adaptations of the books I'd read. And so that was sort of my way into realizing that it was definitely for me, this genre.
Was there a particular adaptation that stood out to you or that you really were excited by or connected with?
I found the owner of Christine really hot. So I was definitely into that when I saw that adaptation. That was what I paid most attention to, not the car per se, but the car's owner. Obviously, The Shining really sort of messed with me as an 8-year-old or whatever, however old I was when I watched it. That's the most sort of memorable experience, was sort of being in awe of what a movie could do. Especially the horror stuff, obviously, but also just the general filmmaking of it.
Yeah, Christine's a great story because it feels so silly, and maybe in retrospect is silly to think about car horror. Mm-hmm. But some ways it's kind of made a return. We've come back to sort of putting horror into the inanimate or things that don't necessarily seem like they will scare us. But yeah, it's a great testament to Christine the story and Christine
Mhm.
the film that it's as effective as it is.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Addie?
So I also had a really strict father, so I do have a really strong memory of seeing it, which I didn't actually realize until recently was considered a miniseries. I saw it at a friend's 13th birthday party and was petrified by actually every single thing other than Tim Curry. It was really all the little signs that start to show up of it, in particular, like the blood in the sink was like the most terrifying thing to me ever. But because I wasn't really allowed to watch scary movies, I think that a lot of it started with books. So Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, if we can call that horror, I was really obsessed with them from an early age. And definitely Stephen King, but Christopher Pike's series, I was obsessed with them. So I think because I come from an abusive childhood, so for me horror was this real struggle between feeling like it did sort of access this space of like pain and relationship to the body, but also feeling like because I had that relationship to sort of threat and danger, I hyper believed everything that was happening on the screen. So unless, and I said this in other places, unless it felt sort of worth it to me, I was actually like pretty terrified of horror and wasn't really interested in it. So for me, it had to, even from an early age, really hit in this psychological place or this body horror place where I felt like it sort of helped me understand something about myself. Otherwise, I was like, why do I want to put myself through this if it's just going to be stressful and it's not that great of a movie? So those are sort of some ways that I entered into it as a young person.
Great. Sumiko?
Oh, okay. Hey, first of all, I want to warn you that my computer might shut down, so I might come back with my phone a little bit. But anyway, I was a child. First of all, I want to say my parents were not strict. My parents were hippies. I was born in 1968. I'm biracial. They almost would have had to be super liberal because it was illegal for them to get married until like when I was literally conceived. So when they got married, it was not actually legal in the United States yet. So they were rebels. Also, my mom literally turned 21 months before I was born. So my mom was only 20 years old when I was born. So they met in college. And so they took us to horror movies in drive-ins because that's what they had. And they had this like little playground in the front. And I remember being like 5 years old in the playground playing, and stuff would come on the screen like, It's Alive, which was like this monster baby crawling out of the womb. I forget, like some movie with a demon at Mary Bloody Mary, which was one where the Antichrist ate his way out of the woman's belly. It was a different time. I don't think that people have their kindergartners playing in the playground, watching monster babies eat their way through the womb anymore. It's just not a thing, but that was normal back then. And so none of that really scared me, but then they took me to Jaws and I made them check to see if there were sharks in the bathtub before I would take a bath for quite a while after that. And also, science fiction is scary to me still. It was then. So the end of Planet of the Apes, when I found out that they were like on Earth, I had like nightmares about this idea of a catastrophic like world-ending event. And then almost as if knowing what my fears were, the 70s decided to hit me with a whole bunch of echo terror that was all about how humanity was bad for the planet and the planet was coming back for revenge. So yeah. As far as reading goes, they also read a lot of horror and a lot of like dystopic science fiction. So the first horror novel I read was Peter Straub's Ghost Story, and then the next one was The Talisman, which was Peter Straub and Stephen King. So that's how I started getting into Stephen King. And honestly, they had, I mean, I'm like 12 reading this stuff, right? So they had Dune, and like Dune Messiah really scared me. I think that was horror for me. Like I didn't see how that was not supposed to be scary. So yeah, that's pretty much what happened.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. My dad had a collection of all the original Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror comics, and he used to read them to us as bedtime stories. So he wasn't a hippie, but he just loved horror. And when we got through all of them, which we did eventually, he just made them up. And so, you know, here's to parents who are open about horror. So the next question that I have is I want to take some time to talk about everyone's respective essay in the collection. For those who are here in the audience, you presumably know that It Came from the Closet is a collection of memoir, creative nonfiction, personal essay with film criticism and analysis to varying degrees, and also to, you know, to the taste and the necessity of the individual writer. So it's not scholarly in the traditional sense, which is exactly what I wanted. I wanted a book that used a specific horror film as a lens to think about some sort of queer experience. And I wanted the writers to do it in a way that felt right to them and felt like it would surprise us and make us think about something in the film and in the genre that we maybe hadn't before, and maybe help us think about our own very diverse and yet collective experiences as queer people in a new light as well. So we'll start with Sumiko, just in case she loses power. But I would love to hear about how you chose the film. And this is something that, you know, I get asked a lot. I didn't assign films to anybody. Submissions came to me, or if I solicited writers, they told me their ideas, and we went, you know, we saw where it went, and we worked together to varying degrees through various edits. But it was up to the writer to tell me what film they were concentrating on and why it was important to the story they wanted to tell. So if everybody could just take a few minutes to share what that experience was like, how you came to settle on the film, what the drafting process was like, if you started with one film and then dropped it and went with another, if your essay saw many drafts and iterations, what happened between those drafts, and just sort of what your connection was to that film and why you felt driven to write about it and think about it in a way that maybe others had not yet. So we'll start with Sumiko.
First of all, I'm going to say I'm a non-binary person, and my pronouns are they, them, and z here. I don't use she, her pronouns, and haven't since like 2018. That said, so yeah, I wrote about Nia DaCosta's Candyman. When the original Candyman came out, that was a really big deal for me. I had seen Tony Todd in, like, he was in a remake of Night of the Living Dead that I loved. So that was very iconic for me. And having, you know, serious movies, serious Black horror movies was just not a thing. They were all like Tales from the Crypt. They all had to be like really making fun of yourself and almost like a minstrel show vibe because of all of the anti-Black prejudice. So when there was something serious like that, even though they actually had Tony Todd playing the villain, it still meant really a lot to me as a member of the Black community. And when the pandemic kind of broke and we got back into movie theaters, Nia DaCosta's Candyman was coming out, and I went out with my girlfriend, who is also a non-binary person, and a group of our friends. So me and my girlfriend are in a DS relationship, and a bunch of people from the, queer kink community were in the theater with us, as well as people from the goth community. But bottom line was, I was the only Black person in there, and there was only one other person of color in the whole theater. Yeah, my battery is running low. So I really wanted to talk about the importance of intersectionality for me as a queer person who is Black, and also issues related to being biracial. My father was Ashkenazi Jewish, and my mother, African American, because there's a lot of, interracial weird stuff going on in the original Candyman. And because they come with a really Black centering focus, with the Nia DaCosta version of Candyman, I wanted to talk about how over time the series changed to make it so that Black people were more centered, but they also had a queer character in the movie, well, too, and they were an interracial couple. So I wanted to talk about it. There's something that they call a magical, Negro trope, and they really took it and they put it right on the queer character, like they really did, and they put it on him hard. And with this trope, on one hand, it makes it so that it's like the safest character in the movie, the person who's least likely to actually die, unless Stephen King writes it, and then that's it. You're gonna also be a big martyr. So he kind of had the safest role with him and his boyfriend, but it is also kind of like a one-note, wooden character that doesn't have very much depth. I wanted to talk a lot about how I had to deal with different types of intersectionality and issues with, you're in the Black community and people are not always really jiving with you as a queer person. And then you're in the queer community and there's just a lot of stuff that people do not understand about Blackness and how these different things came together. So the essay is called Centered and Seen because as we were in the writing process and the editing process together. Well, me, I write for the San Francisco Bayview, which is a national Black newspaper. So I'm in there writing a whole bunch of stuff, that like people with a different politic might say like I'm over woke or whatever, but I really don't care. Nonetheless, it had to be kind of a little bit more upbeat and positive or something like that. So we worked it over so it could become like more positive and happy or something like that, which I'm okay with. But I will say that if you do see Nia DaCosta's Candyman, you will see that I have a lot in common with how the filmmaker and viewed it, in terms of that the film really documents a whole bunch of things that the Black community went through and how they, it's really all about how people that are othered are vilified and over time become not the victim anymore, but the villain. And so you can only have one of two roles. You can either be the victim or the villain, the victim or the villain. And this is the same role that goes on with queer people, especially with trans people. This is really a lot of how trans people are portrayed in movies, in horror, and it's just horrible. I mean, you get stuff like Psycho and Silence of the Lambs. It's just awful, really. So I wanted to talk about that, about how the movie shows people that have been historically othered taking back the narrative and making it so that we're really calling out the people that are oppressing us for the fact that they're actually portraying us as villains because they're scared of us because they did bad things to us. And this is like a horror genre, like going way back. It's like, Stephen King is writing about how white people are afraid that the Native Americans are going to get pissed off because we're occupying their land and then they're going to, put a curse on you. All this stuff. The monkey's paw, going way back. And this happens when in narratives
Okay, we lost Sumiko for now, but they did a really spectacular job of representing the scope of their essay, Centered and Seen, which, yeah, is a remarkable essay. And during the drafting phase, it got longer and longer and more layered and layered. And it was one of those moments where, as an editor, I kept saying, keep going, keep going. I want this to be as long and have as many roots as possible and as many threads, and we'll pull them together. And we did. So I hope when folks read it, they can see actively everything that Sumiko was describing. Addie?
I was hoping you were going to ask me next, because I felt like it sort of connects with what Sumiko was saying, in the sense that I also wrote about a film that I felt took an oft-used trope that connects to my lived experience, and I just felt dealt with it in a new way. I would say, I guess, the initial, I kind of wanted to write about a million films, and then Joe and I eventually realized that the real heart of what I wanted to write about was Dead Ringers. I'm actually really excited that I did decide to take on Dead Ringers, because the more that I've talked about this book, the more I'm realizing nobody is seeing this film anymore. So I really hope that people watch it again. But Dead Ringers is a Cronenberg film that centers identical twin gynecologists. They're both played by Jeremy Irons. It's in the 90s, mid 90s, I think. And there were a few things that I thought were really interesting about it. I often like to talk about or react against, as an identical twin, I get really, really tired of the way that twins are used in horror, and that they're sort of fetishized, and nobody really actually cares that they're fetishized, because most people don't actually think twins exist, sort of. It's not it's not like talking about a person of color. It's not like talking about a queer person. We're not we're not an identity in the way that we think of identities. So I feel that we are, that there's a lot of prejudice and fetishization that happens over and over again, and nobody really questions it. So obviously Dead Ringers is a horror film, so it's still working with the trope, but I just felt like it complicated it in really interesting ways. When Jeremy Irons talks about the process of playing these twins, he played one twin standing on the balls of his feet. He played the other one on his heels. And so you sort of see this kind of separation of the two men, but the way that Cronenberg sort of has them slowly enmesh and sort of addresses this kind of tension that I think identical twins do face with attachment and individuation, I thought was really interesting. And Dead Ringers is based on, I don't think this is giving anything away, but it is based on actual twin gynecologists who had, I'll just say there's a news story that he found about how they ended up. That's very tragic. And so Cronenberg wrote to that end moment. So the ending is the story that he found, and he built the story going towards that end point. And so, yeah, so I just really wanted to talk about, I first saw this film in my mid-20s, and I'd literally never seen any film that I felt psychologically really got to the heart of what it is to be an identical twin. And I don't think I've ever come across anything since either that I think does such an interesting work with it. And so my essay is sort of thinking about that moment, about the moment of witnessing this film and feeling, even as it's an exaggeration, feeling that there is part of my experience that I feel seen in that film, that is sort of mirrored, I guess, with actual lived experience that I have with my twin sister that is complicated and actually sort of trope-like in ways that I would prefer it wasn't, but it's just the nature of my life. So yeah, and then I think other parts of the process that slowly came into it was just my wanting to sort of lay it against these other pop culture sort of representations of how twins are dealt with, like especially in the 80s and 90s, kind of going up to this moment of Dead Ringers. So yeah. Oh my god, yay! I just saw somebody has seen it for the first time.
Yeah. I think Rachel Weisz is starring in like an Amazon remake series of it.
Really?
Which will be, yeah, that I remember reading it last year. I don't think I'm making it up. I think it's real. It just is not out yet. And for those of you who haven't read Addie's essay yet, Addie so delicately, your piece is one that I would categorize a little more into the creative nonfiction side because the structure and the poetics of it, and you very delicately insert pieces from Dead Ringers throughout. It's very sparse and in a way that I think is really inviting the reader to see the film for themselves. So even though there are spoilers in the entire book, I warn in the introduction. So hopefully people don't skip the introduction and then realize too late that everything gets really completely spoiled in these essays, out of necessity mostly. But you do this really excellent job of just planting little seeds from the film and I think make the reader want to go and see it for themselves. The representation of it is really inviting the reader to check it out themselves and to experience it for themselves. So I applaud that. Richard.
Thanks, Addie. That was really, really interesting. Yeah, so I wrote this essay before Joe conceived of this book. So I sort of backed into my essay, my subject. I did an MFA in fiction. And so for a few years after that, I was writing this novel that was centered on, this closeted kid and his experience of the world. I needed him to sort of feel like what he was seeing in the world was completely not what other people were seeing. So I found myself really going back to horror tropes and just sort of seeing what would work for him in terms of getting his story moving and figuring out what I was writing about, really, And then like maybe a year in, I realized I'm writing about my own childhood, as we do. So I was like, okay, like what about my childhood is making me interested in this kid and his story and what he's up to and why horror? Like, why am I immediately going to horror elements, right? And so I remembered, my own obsession with horror as a kid and Halloween specifically, the film Halloween by John Carpenter, during a period of my life when my parents were really troubled. Lots of stuff was going wrong with the adults in my life that sort of made me even more isolated beyond the sort of queer isolation we have as a kid. I was really sort of by myself a lot. And so as I'm working on this fiction, I'm realizing like I'm starting to write about that experience, and I'm starting to think about like why I identified so much with these horror villains that I was watching, specifically Michael Myers. Thinking about desire, thinking about desiring behind a mask, desiring from the shadows, that kind of thing, and what that desire meant. Like Michael Myers desiring dead teenagers is different than what I was desiring, but one would hope, right? But like the way it was portrayed, the way the camera moved in the film, the way Michael Myers was framed in contrast to the other people, the other characters in the film, the way like all of that sort of like was creating a language for me for what I was experiencing at the time. And like 25, 30 years later, when I'm writing this piece, I'm starting to realize that, put the connections together. And so writing the essay was really a joy of discovery in that way for me, making sense of some things I've been thinking about for a long time. And I hadn't written much nonfiction beyond criticism before that. And so I really sort of taught myself how to write a narrative in a memoir, a narrative in memoir for the first time with the work on the essay. So I'm very grateful that it is now appearing in this book alongside all these other amazing writers.
Yeah, and I'm really happy to disclose that in the process of making this book, Richard's essay was the example. I came across it while he posted it, and I knew that he'd written it, and I was so floored. And I said, yes, this is what I'm talking about. This is the kind of thing that I want a whole book of. So Richard's essay is one of 4 previously published in the entire collection. But it was really the thing that I was able to say, this is what I want. Because I thought I'd have to write it myself, and then that feels a little, like a little unorthodox or something in the process of your proposal for an anthology, right? Saying, I want things that look like the thing that I just wrote, because then the answer would be, well, maybe write a memoir or write do it yourself. And I didn't want to do it by myself. I wanted to make something for us, with us. So the ability to point to Richard's essay was really key. And it helped to, I would send it out as an example to others. This is kind of the thing I want you to write, but I don't want you to copy it. I want you to do your own thing. And so I'm very happy to give him that credit, and well-deserved credit, because it really was the light bulb, or the idea was there, but it was my ability to say, here's the idea, and here is proof that the idea can work. And so thank you for that, Richard.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah. Jude.
All right. Well, I wrote about a French movie called In My Skin. I will not attempt to say the French title at all. I cannot pronounce it. But, and it's a movie that's not that well known over here. I have always loved it. And I think if you look back at like my earliest writing, there are like blog posts from 2009 where I'm like, this movie says everything about gender. And early in my transition, I sort of went back to it and realized this does not say everything about gender. This is you working out something very, very personal to yourself. And In My Skin, I'll just sort of recap it, because it's relatively obscure, concerns a woman who seems more or less to have her life together. She's kind of bored with everything and everyone around her. And one night she manages to injure her leg really badly without noticing it. Maybe she's drunk, maybe it's nerve damage, but it opens up this gap for her where she realizes that she and her body are not quite identical. That for whatever reason, she's not all the way in her body. And she just slowly develops this more and more extreme obsession with cutting herself and with forcing her body through extreme experiences, and with like trying to see what it's going to take for her to connect literally with the physical form that she embodies. Is it different from her? Is it her? And that to me, when I wanted to write about queerness and horror, like that sort of summed up a lot of the questions that I was thinking about early in my transition. The idea that you can put yourself through this extreme experience, and this experience that's like, a lot of the language around particularly transmasculine people is just like, you're mutilating your perfectly healthy breasts and you're making yourself hideous, and like all of this stuff about, mutilation and disfigurement, and the idea of like, well, what does it mean that like maybe you have to cut yourself apart and put yourself through something extreme to get back into your physical form, felt to me like, there are a lot of ideas in that essay. I'm not gonna say that it's maybe, this is not what they're gonna print in my obituary, maybe, but In My Skin just felt like a really personal way to talk about like how we live in our bodies, and how sometimes doing really gross stuff is just necessary to like get back in there.
Awesome, thank you. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip to a fun question. That might be our last one, so we have time to take some questions. I'm really curious, and I hope you've thought about it. And if you haven't, I'm gonna put you on the spot. If you could write, or at least vividly imagine in the theater of your mind, a queer remake or queer reimagining of an existing horror film, what would it be, and why, and what would you do with it? Let's see. Go, Jude. Go first.
I put so much thought into this, and I now have 2 answers. One, canonically in Alien, several of the characters are trans, and it's just never mentioned on screen. So I would, like Veronica Cartwright is, whatever his name, like the bearded man that's in every 70s movie is. But I would love to see a version of Alien that is specifically about queer and trans experience, because the idea of just like being a human and being, hunted down by this force of brute reproduction feels like a really overt metaphor that you could do something with. And secondly, I want to see what Ginger Snaps would be like if it were actually trans. That's really cheesy because everybody, Ginger Snaps is like the gender horror movie, but it's about puberty. It's about horrible things happening to you and not being sure that you are yourself anymore. And I feel like there's rich territory.
Yeah, those are both really good answers. I think obviously I never really thought about it, but I think you're right that the Alien franchise has, whether they are acknowledging it explicitly or not, is always doing things with gender and sex and this forced procreation or forced reproduction rather. But we also have these androids that are kind of human and they don't have blood, but they have this questionable white fluid in them that comes out of them in terrible moments, usually when they're being dismembered, right? Or and I think that Ginger Snaps makes a lot of sense too, because I think that of all the horror body transformations, the werewolf is the one that I don't know, is always kind of, it's very difficult to find a great werewolf movie because I think that there's a bit of I don't know, I think that it's always I don't think that it's always thought through like what that transformation is standing in for. There are better werewolf movies than others, but I think that if somebody really hunkered down and thought about it, maybe it'll be Jude who will do it. Let's see, who wants to go next? I want to, Addie, go ahead.
Okay, I just spent some time thinking about this, and I also have two answers. My first answer is the Guadagnino version of Suspiria. I feel like it's right on the edge. I would love to see Susie and the Madam have some like weird, creepy, but beautiful, like lesbianic sort of connection, either leading up to or especially in the like, I don't want to give anything away, but in the prime scene. And then the other one, I have a specific film, but I feel like it could work for a certain subgenre. I would love to see a queer version of The Descent or any final girl film in which the final girl ends up being the final girls. I feel like in The Descent, I'm just going to spoil. So, having the betrayer or whatever, the accomplice to the betrayal, having the person that, she basically learns that her friend has been sleeping with her husband, having the two of them end up together. So she's sort of not alone in the end. I don't know how many of you have seen the London version, but it's a completely different ending, the UK version, that you actually see the after, you see the epilogue. So it'd be interesting to see that epilogue where she doesn't end up alone in what has transpired up until then. So yeah, those are my.
It's interesting that you name two films that I would definitely agree have heavy queer subtext already in there, and that you're suggesting if they just took it further and just kind of cemented it, right, and really went for it, they could be really fulfilling, interesting queer narratives, right?
Well, yeah, and this is my issue with queerness and horror is that it's always subtext. Even if it's really loud, it's never actually in the narrative itself. Something that Jude is pointing out also. And why is that? I mean, we can sort of guesstimate, but I feel like it's time to step over the threshold for that,
Yeah. At the Brooklyn Museum event that we had last week, Carmen Machado was asked about a film that she had seen recently, and she brought up What Keeps You Alive. Have you all seen that? Which is a minor spoiler, but it happens early in the movie. But it's a lesbian couple who go away to like a mountain house, either to celebrate their anniversary or they're recently married, and they're sitting having like a really romantic moment. One is femme, one is butch, and suddenly the femme pushes the butch off the cliff and tries to kill her, but she doesn't die. And so suddenly it's like, whoa, my wife is trying to kill me. And there's this really interesting reversal of the butch being hunted by the femme. And she did a great, I'm butchering how she described it, but I'd seen that movie and I hadn't thought about that really simple but very impactful swapping that happens there. And that's a small indie film that I feel like I think I saw part of it, not all of it, which is also a problem on my end. But yeah, when we do get them, they're some those films are tucked away on Shutter sometimes, and you have to go digging for them. But that does a little bit of what I think we're kind of suggesting here, right? Like sometimes it can just be these reversals that don't have to be like loud or overly like overly done. It can just exist in the film and then do that work. Like it's not always fair for the movie to have to do all that heavy lifting, right? Like we want it to just be a great horror movie and have those elements. Sometimes we want the extra work. Sometimes we want it to be, political and heavy with the message. But sometimes you just want to see those things that you're describing, I think, Addie. Yeah. Richard?
Yeah, when you asked this question, I thought immediately more about form than content. Like the Italian giallo came to mind. Like Argento's Suspiria is probably my favorite of those. The way that he marries, suspense and terror with desire, and there's all this Technicolor, and it's like maximalist, and everything's so intense. To my mind, there hasn't been a queer giallo. Maybe I'm missing one, but like all those movies had this sort of like built-in sensational, sort of like larger than life feelings and like emotions. You're experiencing things like more intensely that actually are in the world. Those feel queer to me as a form, right? Like as this way of just sort of representing something that feels sort of like so like important and all encompassing, but like it often like is invisible to other people too. So it's like the experience of watching those films to me always felt very queer, even if the content was mundane. Like it's kind of like the proto slasher. In a lot of ways, they're kind of just mysteries that are made to look really pretty and intense in this Italian way, But
yeah, that's great. My pick is actually a film that Jude's essay touches on for a bit. David Cronenberg's The Brood is a film that feels right, like it feels completely. And I've been thinking about this because my essay in the collection is about my and my husband's surrogacy experience, and the horrors of that experience, the body horror and the trauma of a stillbirth and a very long, difficult journey that was taxing in every way. And I pair it with the film Grace, which I'm not sure is super widely seen, but there's a woman who is about 8 months pregnant, and she gets into a car accident, and her child dies in the womb, and she carries it to term, delivers the stillbirth, and then wills it back to life by breastfeeding it. But the baby, Grace, does not need milk, she needs blood. And it becomes like a schlocky zombie vampire baby horror movie. And so I found myself connecting to that film for all sorts of reasons. You'll have to read the essay to see why. It involves my baby biting my fingers raw. But I was thinking the whole time that I was writing the essay, I was thinking a lot about The Brood, and I rewatched it. It's such a good movie. Like, I shouldn't even say that it should be remade. I'm sure somebody will do it eventually, but it seems perfectly, especially given what I'm thinking about with surrogacy. I think we could just have a gay couple or male identifying couple, and do it like that, and it would still work. You could almost remake the film as is and just have male characters instead. I don't want to say too much about it because I don't want to spoil it if people haven't seen it, but it'll make sense to you when I say that when you get to the ending, which is maybe one of the best endings in horror movie history. It's so good. The visual is so incredible. It's just such a creative story, and it just feels completely right for just doing that turn just enough and setting it now with a queer couple, and brilliant. I think it could work absolutely as is. Right? Maybe we'll collaborate, Jude. We'll write the script together. I'm gonna ask ER back in case they have some questions for us.
Yeah, so we actually have a ton of audience questions, so I want to ask those because I want to honor all of those. So the first one is a general question for you, Joey. How did you navigate the chance that the reader has not seen the film the writer is discussing and still wanting the reader to get something out of the essay? So basically, if folks haven't watched a lot of these films, and that probably will be the case, how are you hoping that the reader will interact with the essays?
That's a good question. And the simple answer is that I've been teaching essay writing for 15 years now. And the thing that I'm always hammering in my students is represent the text that you want the unfamiliar reader to be able to see. And fortunately, all the writers in this collection understood that inherently when they were writing their essays, that you had to represent and contextualize the film in a way that somebody who had not seen the film could understand, and did not need to have seen the film to make those connections or to understand why those connections are being made. So much of that work was done already by the writers, who sort of inherently understood that they had to do that work. Again, like I said in the introduction, I warned that every film in the collection gets spoiled to some degree, and that was something that had to happen because the writers had to feel freedom to step inside the films and to pull out parts that they needed to, project on the wall and say, we have to look at this moment, or we have to consider this moment. So every reader goes into it, I think, adequately warned and invited to be spoiled, because being spoiled is not such a big deal. I mean, I don't know about the rest of the writers on here, but I love to go to the end of my R.L. Stine book when I was a kid and read the ending first and then go back to the beginning to see how we got there. Some people are just so petrified of the spoiler, but to me, it's just an opportunity to see how the storytelling works. So I hope that answer makes sense, but that's the gist of it, that everybody had to, these are not film reviews. So everybody had to feel free to say whatever about whatever from the film. Otherwise, the essays couldn't have worked.
Yeah, and I put in the chat a little earlier up, I think folks can use this as a film guide. So you absolutely could read this book and use it as a sort of map for viewing. Certainly, I don't know if folks have video stores near them. Atlanta has one video store left, but some of these films are on Shudder. Some of these films are streaming in other places. So I think it would be a really fun challenge to just go down.
And we put the
off.
name of the films that are being discussed underneath the title. So if somebody really wanted to challenge themselves, and there's no month better than October to do it, you can see the film. And if you haven't seen it, you can go find it, watch it, and you can read the respective essay. And that'd be
21 days, folks.
You'd have to double up once or twice
to get her done.
To do it.
You can do it. So Powell Burke says, I loved this book. Has there been any discussion about additional follow-up volumes, a series of queer horror writing?
If we sell 1 million copies, I'll do a part 2 ASAP. I think it's always possible, but I really meant what I say in the introduction, that the hope was that this would be the beginning of something, right? Not a definitive collection, but the first of its kind. It really is the first of its kind. That's the reason that I wrote. And I edited the book and wanted to collect the writing because it just didn't exist. I was waiting around for it. I said, there must be something like this. I want to read personal essay that discusses horror. I can't find it. And then, you know, it was time to be a good gay Virgo and do it myself. And that's what I did. And, but I wanted to be the start of something. I want other, you know, marginalized voices to consider themselves in relationship to horror film. There could be more queer, you know, centric anthologies, but, you know, and maybe we'll do another one, but I wanted to really just crack open, you know, the more we can get away from horror as, you know, I don't know that horror has ever explicitly been something that we could say is like a cis hetero white dude thing. But the more that we can make sure that nobody ever kind of mistakes it for that, the better. So if it means more queerness or it means other marginalized groups taking this work on, I hope that the book serves as a template, right? Something like seeing that it's out there in the world, somebody else might take on this work and do it with another niche. But I would certainly love the opportunity to revisit this kind of work again. And, you know, we got something like 250 submissions. So a lot of really good writing just didn't make it into the book because, you know, there wasn't the space for it. So it exists. There's work out there for more volumes for sure.
You're getting a lot of gay Virgo solidarity in the chat as well.
Of course, all the gay Virgos are here tonight. Where else would they be?
Yeah. So I think this is really a comment / question for Addie. Reagan asks, are you familiar with the Soska sisters? They are twin film directors / producers, and I've seen a couple of their movies, the first being American Mary, where they actually feature themselves in the movie as a pair of twins seeking extreme body modification.
I'm just floored that I've never heard or read about them because I widely am always looking for twin things. It's a, you know, it's a pretty central place that I write from, and this is a particular aspect to the kind of writing that I like to do. But I'm super excited to dig into it after this. So thank you so much.
All right. Yeah. So Richard Powell Burke says, I was intrigued by the passage in your essay about Laurie pulling off Michael's mask. There's so much writing out there about the final girl trope and how queer audiences are invited to see themselves in that archetype. But this reading really flipped that. I'm curious about your personal relationship or lack thereof to the final girl archetype, maybe in other horror films.
Well, I guess for that particular scene, I remember feeling like, oh, this is a final girl who's like, yes, of course she wants to get away, but in that moment, what she wants most is to know, right? She wants to know who it is who's been after her. And that was scary to me as a closeted kid. I was like, oh God, like the worst thing in the world is for someone to like figure out who I am. And then like, now they know, like now they can sort of go backwards and look at our life together, our time together, and sort of rewrite it, right? And think about, oh, all these things that I was maybe thinking, like now they know what I was thinking all. So yeah, I mean, that scene, I'm glad that resonated with you because it's a really important scene for me. The final girl as a trope, I mean, so much has been written about the final girl as a trope. You know, it's something that's been mined from a million different directions. I guess I just like the chance to think about her as a person who's sort of realizing that maybe not the world around her is queer, but the world around her is like complicated and dark and different, more different than she understood at the beginning of the film or whatever, at the beginning of her experience. And sort of like queerness is a way that is a force that's like complicating our understanding of each other in the world, right? And so like to watch the final girl encounter evil is for me also a way to see her sort of understand there's this bigger thing out there that she, you know, that was never meant for her initially, and now she's thrust into it.
Yeah. So this is a sort of general question, but for all of you, do you recommend, for each of you in your essays, do you recommend watching the film you wrote about before or after reading your piece in the book for maximum enjoyment? So I'm curious if y'all have different answers for this, depending on your pieces.
Jude, what do you think? You start us off.
I think within my skin, it really depends. I think it's a movie that gets read as like just a very gross movie a lot. Because it is. It's just like it's a lady trying to eat her own leg off. Like, yeah, it's unfortunate. You might not be ready for it. I've watched it with people who had to leave. So, like, if you want the visceral experience, go in there and just watch it, and then you can read my thoughts afterward. If you, like me, sometimes need to like, I'm going to read this Carol Clover essay about this, and then I'm going to understand the theoretical underpinnings of it, and then I won't be that weirded out by what I'm about to see. I'm happy to be like your little theory condom there, help you shield you from the movie.
Addie, what do you think?
So I was initially going to give the queer Virgo answer, which was going to be both, before, then read, then after. But actually, now I'm thinking about it more from like a twins point of view, and now I'm going to say read it first, so that I can center your like new feeling about twins and horror, and then watch it after. And because twins proliferate so much, so you're already coming with lots of kind of preconceived notions. So I feel like it would actually be good to ground through the essay and then follow it so you can kind of see if your sort of feelings, change and get like more complex. So yeah.
Richard?
I guess I have two answers, because on one hand, like the plot of Halloween is so simple. Like nothing much happens beyond what you could expect happens. We all kind of know the character of Michael Myers in pop culture and what he's all about. So for me, a lot of the interesting connections are made via like Carpenter's framing and the shot structure and the way that the way that things are privileged in the frame and on the screen. But so I would say like, yeah, there's no spoilers really in my essay, but also I would say like, I would be more curious to hear what you thought about my take after you had made your own, because I feel like I do talk about some shot structures that are so specific that I wouldn't want you to encounter them and sort of immediately have my sort of take on it in your head. So it's a good question. I mean, like if you're someone like Joe who like wants to know the end, wants to know what to look for during the experience, then go ahead and read my take, and then we'll argue about yours later.
I also think that of the films that we all wrote about, Halloween, I mean, it's literally been rebooted multiple times. I think it's one of the more ubiquitous, if you know horror, chances are you've seen Halloween. So I think that Richard's essay offers this, new reading. So if anything, I would think if you've seen Halloween already, you'd want to read Richard's essay and then look for those things in the film in a new way. But if you haven't seen the original Halloween, what a treat to be able to do it for the first time. For mine, Grace, I would recommend reading the essay first, because childbirth, stillbirth, loss, these are some of the more realistic horrors, and I think that the essay, I tried not to be super glum in my meditation on the experience, and Grace kind of objectively is a little bit silly in its way, and it's very low budget, and Grace the zombie baby is a terrible animatronic and all that stuff, but everything leading up to that rebirth, the actual birth, is so painstakingly accurate and real that I think that it would trigger a lot of people. So I would, in my case, recommend reading the essay and then thinking if you could stomach the film after reading what I described, because I do, I don't go into gory detail, but I feel like I faithfully represent what that character experiences in relationship to my husband and our surrogate's experience. So in that case, I would say it would be kinder to the self, I think, to read the essay first.
So my final question is just, I know just anecdotally at Charis and from talking to customers and talking to people in my communities that horror is experiencing kind of a zeitgeist right now. There's a lot of new energy, particularly from queer and trans people, but from feminists, from people of all races and cultural backgrounds. And there's been this infusion of, excitement about what horror can do. Um, I'm curious for y'all, A, if you agree with that, and B, what you sort of credit that to. Are you experiencing the zeitgeist? Do you feel like, yeah, here's why, it's because Donald Trump got elected, or it's because, like, I'm curious what your, why you think this moment in history, certainly even this anthology is, it's cresting on a moment. I mean, it's really connecting with a lot of people, as it should. Your writing is also good, and I think it's the right book at the right time. And so I'm just wondering, um, what do you think it is about our particular era right now that is causing this resurgence for people? Addie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I come from this like in two different ways. Obviously my relationship to the anthology, but I also just had a Queer Frankenstein come out 2 months ago. I would say that queer horror in particular, to me, is coming out of two sort of cultural shifts. One is that we're seeing a lot of horrifying things happen in this moment that we really, a lot of us sort of expected, but I think many of us are really shocked by what this world is, and not just COVID, but the rise of anti-trans legislation, the rise of book banning. There are a lot of tensions, I think, happening politically that are, Roe versus Wade, where we sort of are seeing ourselves in this surreal sort of current, but kind of going backwards into moments that many of us did not live through the first time, or we were very young the first time these things came around. But I feel like I think there's like a sort of like a horror connection to the societal movements that are happening. And I think COVID's part of that too. But I feel like at the same time, we're seeing people who are underrepresented, minoritized people, queer people really pushing up and really challenging things, and fighting back and being visible, and forcing a very interesting tension that was not happening before. And so I feel like those things are kind of intersecting in this really interesting and I think potential way that the book is sort of landing on and into. So yeah, that's sort of my 2 cents.
Yeah, I want to build on what Addie said, and something that Addie said pretty early on too, which is that they responded to horror in part because of an abusive childhood, and that was very much the case for me too. Like I remember, like the first horror movie I ever deeply cared about was The Shining, and it's a good movie, but it's also a movie that I responded to as somebody whose alcoholic dad had a nervous breakdown and became violent. Like I was having a very literal reaction to the story. Horror is a place where we are allowed to talk about the violence in our lives, and it can be really confusing and alienating to go through mainstream society, and to have all these polite conversations where violence is always framed as something other and out there and unlikely and strange, when for many of us it's just baked into the foundation. It is what life is made of. Not to be glum about it, but just like violence is very much part of life. Fear is very much part of life. Everybody who's marginalized in any way has to live their life bargaining with, am I safe here? Am I not safe here? What are the odds of something bad happening? And I think that maybe in this moment, it's not just that these, the sort of rise of fascist ideologies has terrified us. It's that we now have the means to talk about violence and make it visible in a way that's relatively new. Like, Me Too making like the vast, vast numbers of sexual assaults happening, more visible, Black Lives Matter, and like how the fact that like we are more and more witnessing people's deaths, just as we go about our day. The structures of violence and the fact that violence is so endemic and so everywhere is like with us now. And I think that that's driving us back to the art form where we're allowed to like really dive into the experience of violence and what it is and what it means to be just like up against an overwhelming force fighting for your life.
Yeah, I think Addie said something earlier about how queerness has kind of always had to be so sexual in horror, at least till now. And I think so has politics too, right? And so you have a filmmaker like Jordan Peele who's like bringing explicit genre elements to his storytelling, but also talking about important, current political events and current political crises. And I think like the public or whatever, the mainstream reading public, mainstream film going public is like maybe newly appreciating horror as a vessel for sort of getting those ideas across. And people who would normally discount horror just as a sort of schlocky, entertainment is now sort of being told by the culture that no, there's important idea work going on in this genre.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I think that horror has always been doing these things. But now we see it because there are the loudmouths and the trolls who are attacking the Jordan Peels or, up in arms over, Pinhead being played by a trans actress, even though the Hell Priest is androgynous with a feminine voice in the original text. And, and we think of even like a problematic but beloved film like Sleepaway Camp that, we've always understood differently than someone else who is, not queer who's watching that. So we've all sort of always been the final girl, and we still are collectively, because the final girl is, somebody decided you must have a character who is pure and doesn't let these outside influences get in their way or doesn't muddle their ability to think and overpower and outsmart whatever is after them. And, I have a friend who says that being queer is truly a superpower because we see the world from a very young age through very specific eyes that until you learn that there are other queer people, you think is, it's only you. And so you have to navigate the world and everyday mundane situations like a conversation with a brother watching a sport or with a, teacher or a priest or, whatever in your life, because you're always afraid that they can smell it on you. So you work really hard to steel yourself against those outside forces. So it's always been true. And I think that now, because there's dissent and pushback by, like going back to Sumiko's piece, when Anita DaCosta remade Candyman, like, can't believe they're making it all about race. I'm not going to see this. And it's like, what? Did you see the original film? Like, the only, it's a great movie. And arguably the biggest problem with it is that it's made by a bunch of white people, but the film is already that. What do you like? This is just it being more of itself. So I think horror is more of itself and what it always has been. I think that now that we can come out of the shadows and out of the closet to claim it for ourselves and participate and actively make it and have a say in, and this is, I'm saying it as if there's so much of it. There's not, like, there still needs to be much more. Ryan Murphy can't do it by himself, and I wish he would do a lot less, right? So but it's there, it's in our consciousness, but it's just that it's coming to the surface. It's being, it's rising to the top now, but it's always been there, and we've always been there. And I think that that's I hope that makes sense, but that's just sort of my gut that it's always been for us, even when it's not for us. We, it's there for us. It is us.
Yeah. I think horror has always been for marginalized people. It's just not been named in that So, well, thank y'all so much. And thank you to Sumiko as well. And I really, really, really have enjoyed the book and enjoyed tonight. And I hope that everybody watching at home, if you don't have a copy yet, click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy It Came from the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror from Charis. It really helps us when you buy your books directly from us. You can also, if you already own the book, you can, of course, buy another copy for a friend. You can support the work of Charis Circle, our nonprofit. A donation of any amount really helps us. That's how we pay for all of these events and this platform. The other thing you can do is ask your library to carry this book. So if you don't have a book budget, no worries. We just encourage you to always ask your public library to carry this book, because one of the ways that we can fight back against censorship is to make ourselves known, particularly in public. So reminding your local library that queer books and trans books matter, and that we are part of the fabric of the community. So make sure that this book is available from your library. And thank you always to Feminist Press. I see Jisoo is in the house. They always do such a great job. So thank you to Feminist Press for all of their wonderful work in the industry. And thank you to all of you. Congratulations on this. I hope it will continue to be a great success.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Yar. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Have a great